Trump reacting to the news that his former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, has pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI amid a fundraising trip to New York City. Trump appearing to downplay the developments, saying that aside from lying to the FBI, Flynn did nothing illegal. Welcome to a brand new hour inside America's news headquarters. I'm Molly Lyde.
Molly, good to join you today. I'm Kelly Wright, and here we are in New York. President Trump saying he's not concerned about Flynn's guilty plea, which requires him to cooperate with the special counsel's Russian investigation. The president tweeting this, quote, "I had to fire General Flynn because he lied to the vice president and the FBI. He has pled guilty to those lies. It is a shame because his actions during the transition were lawful. There was nothing to hide." Well, Garrett Tenney is following all the details of this story from the White House today. Garrett, how is the White House responding to Flynn's cooperating with the special counsel's investigation?
Well, Kelly, it's interesting. Over the last 24 hours, we've seen a bit of a change in how the White House is portraying Michael Flynn. Everyone that's followed President Trump will remember for more than a year now, he has praised his former national security advisor, called him a good man who he wished he didn't have to fire. Yesterday, the tone from the White House shifted a bit as they tried to diminish Flynn's significance, referring to him as a former Obama administration official who only served as national security advisor for 25 days before getting fired. The president's attorney, Ty Cobb, also downplayed the significance of Flynn's pleading guilty to lying to the FBI and said there's nothing new, while adding in a statement, nothing about the guilty plea or the charge implicates anyone other than Mr. Flynn. And this morning, before leaving the White House, the president said he is not concerned about it either.
No, I'm not. And what has been shown is no collusion. No collusion. There's been absolutely no collusion, so we're very happy. We'll see what happens. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, behind the scenes, though, there is a lot of concern because, as Donald Rumsfeld said, you don't know what you don't know. And Michael Flynn was involved, heavily involved in the campaign, the transition, and in that first month of the administration. So there are all sorts of things he can talk about, and the special counsel has very broad powers to investigate anything that comes up in the course of his work. So it opens a lot of possible doors that they could be looking at.
Which, of course, could be a point of concern, as you've mentioned. Do we have any idea what Michael Flynn might say?
Well, not really, Kelly. You know, there are all sorts of things that he could talk about because of how involved he was. If you look at the deal, though, that he got from special counsel Robert Mueller, it's a pretty sweet one. He was charged with that single charge of lying to the FBI. We also know he was facing charges for his business dealings and meetings he had with Russia and with Turkey. None of those charges were included in yesterday's documents, and that leads legal experts to believe that Flynn does have something worth saying and that Mueller was willing to make this deal with him, even if he doesn't have anything to say directly related to collusion.
People are worried. In particular, if I were, Kushner's lawyer or other lawyers, you've now got someone high enough up that was in conversations that you were already likely asked about. And so if Flynn gave a different description of any of those conversations than they did, then that's a false statement risk. It's not a substantive crime.
Now, in fact, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee has already said he wants to have Kushner come back to that committee for additional questions after seeing these charging documents. The White House, though, it still maintains it believes this investigation will find nothing to substantiate any form of collusion between the campaign and Russia. Kelly?
Still, the story lingers out there. Garrett Tenney reporting for the White House today. Thanks for the update.
Republicans in the Senate are celebrating the passage of their tax bill in the very early morning hours. That bill passed 51 to 49 after a marathon session on the floor, overhauling the U.S. tax code for the first time in decades. Caroline Shively is live in Washington with more. Caroline.
Hi there, Molly. The next step is reconciliation with the House version of the bill. The two are pretty far apart at this point, but Republicans seem to be very motivated to cut a deal because this would be a huge win for the president and the first overhaul of the nation's tax laws in 3 decades. But Democrats say it's a tax scam that mainly benefits businesses and the wealthy. Here was some of the blistering debate last night.
Do I have your word now that you, as a senator, I know you can't speak for everybody, that you, as a senator, after this bill is passed, and I suspect it will be, you will not support any cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid? Do I have that word from you?
I am not going to support any cuts to people who are on the program and need those benefits.
There it is.
But I want this program to survive. I'm going to acknowledge that we need this program for the next generation, too.
He just let the cat out of the box.
The GOP hailed its permanent reduction of the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%. They also pointed to a modest 10-year cut for individuals. An official estimate says the bill would add more than $1 trillion to the deficit, but Republican leaders say that doesn't take into account the massive growth the bill would unleash. Democrats took to Twitter showing the last-minute changes that were being handwritten on the bill, complaining there was no way anyone had time to read the entire piece of legislation, much less study it and figure out how it would affect the economy.
Take a look at this, folks. This is your government at work. Here's the bill as it's written. Here's the modifications that are in it. I can read one word. It's called add this language. Can you tell me what that word is?
The House is coming back a day early on Monday to start the process of blending the two bills together. Molly?
All right, we will see if the GOP can find some fusion there as things move forward. Caroline, thank you very much.
Well, let's stay with this topic. More on this now with Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief at The Hill. Bob, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Hope you're doing well.
Hey, Cal.
You know, early this morning around 2 a.m., Senate Republicans overcame all of the hurdles and impediments that we've seen to their $1 trillion tax reform bill, and they passed it, and much relieved and confident Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell then said, "This is a great day for the country. We have an opportunity to make America more competitive and provide relief to the middle class." Will they now be able to reconcile their differences with the House members and conference, pass it, and get it to President Trump to sign it into law before Christmas?
Yes, and I think it's a good bet they're going to get it done within the next couple of weeks. They've got to move quickly. The bills aren't that different. There are some key differences, but talks have already been underway to merge the bills, and they've got to formally announce who's going to be on this conference committee that will decide it. But this bill has momentum, and I see it passing in the next couple weeks. I don't think it's going to be that difficult. It would have been difficult had the Senate changed their bill and lowered the amount of tax cuts that were going to be in the bill, and that's what Bob Corker wanted, who was the only Republican who voted no. That would have been a problem with the House. They didn't do that. They passed this bill. They're going to get this done.
President Trump is jubilant about it and says this tax reform is going to pave the way for businesses to create more jobs for Americans and for more Americans to put money back into their pockets. But Democrats, as you know, say the Republican bill amounts to, as one congressman said today, legislative malpractice and will hurt many Americans. Do Democrats have a point on this? And if so, are Republicans calling their complaint, is that wrong, or should they try to get some common ground?
Well, they can't get common ground on taxes or certainly on health care. I mean, it's going to be interesting how this bill plays out. It is going to give tax cuts to a lot of people because, I mean, that's why the deficit is going to grow with this. Now, Republicans say that the dynamic scoring is going to help the economy and it will pay for itself. We'll see if that plays out. It's going to be interesting whether Democrats talk more about health care and the failed attempt at replacing Obamacare, or this bill, which I think will become law in the midterm elections. But one thing that Republicans had to do was they had to pass this bill after they lost the Virginia governor's election by almost 10 points. They did unify, unlike on health care, and that's why they're going to get this big win.
So it's important for them. And Kevin Brady, who is the chairman of the House and Ways Committee, he spoke to Neil Cavuto and he said, our focus has been on that middle-class family, on that new entrepreneur, the young person coming out of school trying to get the first job. So that's where he believes those tax cuts will land. Very important for the Republicans to be able to do that so that this is a bill for all people. Will they achieve that? Is this the bill for it?
Well, listen, I mean, there's no doubt about it that this bill, there's some special interests that are very happy about this bill going through. But as Republicans say, that if you're in the middle class, make roughly about $75,000 as a household, that you're going to get a couple $1,000s in tax relief. And that could be significant. So I think there's going to be a PR war going forward of who is helped. And I also think the big question is, reducing the corporate tax rate from 35 to 20, what kind of impact will that have on jobs and the economy? That
well, that's the big question. Everyone's asking that question. We'll wait and see what the answers will be because corporate America has a responsibility to do the right thing, and that is get those tax cuts and then pass it on to the American people in the form of jobs and higher wages. But let's shift just a moment now and discuss the guilty plea of former National Security Advisor Lieutenant General Mike Flynn in the limited amount of time I have right now. As you know, the retired general entered a guilty plea of lying to the FBI about reaching out to the Russians on President-elect Trump's behalf, and said some members of Trump's transition team were involved and at times directing his contacts with Russia. The president brushing that off, saying earlier today he's not concerned at all because, quote, there was absolutely no collusion. So we are very happy. Is the president premature in his happiness, or should there be some cause for concern as this case proceeds, because it's still lingering out there in the public?
Oh, I mean, I definitely think there's cause for a lot of concern, because unlike Ty Cobb, the president's main lawyer, recently said that this probe is going to end up ending soon. It's not ending soon. But the question is, what does Flynn know, and is he telling everything to Mueller? Then the question is, well, wait a minute. Flynn lied to the vice president about his Russia contacts. He also lied to the FBI. How credible a witness is Flynn if you don't have anything else? So that's going to be a question, I imagine, that Trump allies are going to be raising in the coming weeks.
As you know, even Alan Dershowitz has said, you know, that this is really, he's not saying it's a slam dunk, but he's saying that Michael Flynn is damaged goods, even to the special counsel Robert Mueller, because of the fact that he lied to the vice president of the United States and the FBI. So how can they move forward counting upon him to be a credible witness?
I think the only way is if they have documentation, if they have emails, recorded calls, anything like that. Just his word, I don't think, unless it's corroborated with others, it's going to be very suspect in a legal standing. You
said a key word right there, if it's corroborated, and that's
yes.
what people will be waiting to see. Meanwhile, the White House is downplaying the role that Michael Flynn played in that transition, and the president, of course, moving forward and focusing on tax reform. Bob Cusack, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good day to you.
All right, we are awaiting remarks from National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster at the Reagan National Defense Forum, this annual event taking place at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin is there live. It is a beautiful place, but a serious topic. Jennifer.
It is very beautiful, and we are about to hear from the National Security Advisor. We've just spoken to a senior U.S. defense official who tells us that North Korean ballistic missile test this week, that missile broke up on re-entry. That is a key point, that the North Koreans have not been able to get over this hurdle of having the missile survive re-entry. Right now, we understand that allies are searching for parts of that, the remnants of that missile in the ocean. But this is a key development. It's clear that the North Koreans still have some work to do on their ballistic missile program. My next guest, Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson, knows a lot about missiles and about airplanes. And let me ask you, you have said in the past that you are short of missile interceptors. You also have a situation where you are 2,000 pilots short in the Air Force. The B-1 bombers, half of the fleet can't fly. What is going on?
We are low on readiness. I mean, the Air Force has been stretched to the very limit. We've been at continuous combat operations for 27 years, and we are much smaller than we ever were. So we need to restore the readiness of the force so that we can win any fight.
And will these budget increases, how quickly can you turn it around?
For us, readiness is a lot about people, and so when we lose a pilot who has 10 years of experience, it takes 10 years to restore the force. But we're increasing pilot training, we're working on pilot retention. The most important thing we can do, though, is to lift the sequester in its current form. There is nothing that our adversaries have done to damage the Air Force more than sequester.
And that's the Budget Control Act that Congress would have to lift in order for you to get any of the money required to rebuild. Tell me about these airmen who are having to scrounge the boneyard, that desert scrap heap, for parts for their planes so that they can deploy. Why are they having to do that?
Well, we've got a shortage of parts, but it's not just parts. It's about people as well, and munitions, and just making sure that we're ready for any fight. But I got to tell you, it's not that we wouldn't go. If there was a crisis anywhere around the world, your airmen will go. Low readiness rates means that fewer of them will come back. That's what low readiness
More
means.
deaths is what you're saying.
More of them will die in combat.
And what are you seeing in terms of, is there a link between these budget cuts and the increase in training accidents and accidents in the air?
We have not found a link there, and the United States Air Force does everything it can to be safe and to make sure that our pilots are trained. Our biggest problem is we have too few of them. So we're about 2,000 pilots short right now, roughly 1,300 fighter pilots short. That means we're really burning out our people. They're at a very, very high operating tempo.
How small is the Air Force now? Can you put it in perspective for us?
We are the smallest and the oldest that we have been in our history. Now, this budget that the Congress is I hope, about to pass, get beyond this continuing resolution, will help us turn the corner and start to increase our end strength to get more people back in the service.
But if you compare it to 1991 and the Gulf War,
sure.
How small are you compared to that?
As an example, 1991 of the Gulf War, we had 134 fighter squadrons. Today I have 55.
Wow.
If we had to go to war in the Pacific, it is all active guard and reserve. Everyone would have to be in, because the Air Force is the stopping force. We have to be there and ready to go.
Given these shortages, if you had to fight an air war against China or Russia, would you win?
There would be a lot of, none of us want to be in a fight, in a high-end fight. The readier we are, the more likely it is we will never have to fight against Russia or China.
Thank you very much, Secretary Wilson.
Thank you.
And now we'll be hearing from H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor. Our own Brett Baer will be interviewing him shortly. I'll toss it back to you. Thank you.
All right, Jennifer, thank you. She's talking there about military readiness, and we're likely to hear more on that later today. Kelly?
Well, there's a lot of concern out there, obviously, about military readiness, and we'll have more from the Reagan National Defense Forum as it becomes available. Special report anchor Brett Baer, our colleague, will speak with National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, as you heard Jennifer talk about, in less than an hour from now, as a matter of fact. And when that happens, we will bring it to you live when it all begins and unfolds, so you can be the first to see it. Meantime, San Francisco in defense as a sanctuary city after the stunning verdict in the Kate Steinle murder trial. This, as the suspect now faces the prospect of new legal action. We'll have details on that next.
Officials in San Francisco defending their sanctuary city policy after an illegal immigrant from Mexico is acquitted of murder in the shooting death of Kate Steinle. The Mexican national had previously been deported 5 times. Now there could be new legal action. Will Carr is live from Los Angeles. Will.
Hey there, Molly, and there's a twist, and it's that the DOJ announced Friday it issued an arrest warrant for Zarate, who'd been deported 5 times, like you said, before he fatally shot Kate Steinle back in 2015. This week, a jury in San Francisco acquitted Zarate of the most serious charges that he faced. He was convicted for possessing a firearm, and he currently remains behind bars. His attorneys argued that the shooting was a freak accident. President Trump, who has frequently used the Steinle shooting as an argument for tougher immigration policies, immediately criticized the verdict, tweeting, "The Kate Steinle killer came back and back over the weakly protected Obama border, always committing crimes and being violent, and yet this info was not used in court. His exoneration is a complete travesty of justice. Build the wall." And take a listen to Attorney General Jeff Sessions.
And it's time for this country to get its head on straight. These cities should not be protecting criminal aliens.
You may remember that Zarate was released from San Francisco's jail shortly before the shooting, despite a federal request to hold the 7-time felon for deportation. But after the verdict, Mayor Ed Lee maintains the city is and always will be a sanctuary city. And listen to State Senator Scott Wiener.
People have every right to criticize the jury verdict, to express those views, but what the president is doing is using this family's and this community's horrible tragedy to fan the flame of hatred against immigrants.
But many conservatives aren't as understanding. This weekend on Twitter, Molly, there are hashtags boycott San Francisco and Kate's Wall. Molly.
All right, Will Carr, thank you for the update. We appreciate it.
Coming up, a live look at the Reagan National Defense Forum taking place in Simi Valley, California. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster is expected to deliver remarks there at the end of the hour and speak with our own Brett Baer. Special report will bring you all of that live. Plus, Michael Flynn pleads guilty to lying to the FBI. What's the impact on the White House? Our political panel will weigh in next.
deputy assistant to President George W. Bush. And Michael Tobman is the Democratic strategist and former aide to Senator Chuck Schumer. Thank you both for being here.
How are you?
I am doing wonderful. Glad to be here. So to kick things off, Michael Flynn essentially has said he'll be cooperating. And he's someone who was very close to the administration and to President Trump before, during the campaign, during the transition, and following. Do you think folks in the White House are replaying conversations they may have had with Mr. Flynn and when they had them, that sort of thing? Michael?
Oh, absolutely. You know the old saying, 3 people can keep a secret only if 2 of them are dead. It has to be a very stressful time for everyone who had interactions with him. But while for all the bluster and all the spin and all the rhetoric and press strategy around this, because lawyers are involved and it's a special prosecutor, it becomes very binary, very black and white, very technical and very legal. Is the threshold met for a certain crime? And no amount of tweeting and no amount of yelling and huffing and puffing is going to change that analysis.
You know, the president has repeatedly said no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. His own lawyer coming out and saying the false statements involved mirror the false statements to the White House officials, which resulted in the resignation in February of this year. So, Brad, bringing you in, essentially they're saying we know he's a liar, he lied, now he's admitted lying. So your thoughts on where the White House stands?
Well, I think the White House should be concerned because there are a number of White House officials who have been under oath speaking to investigators. If they told the truth, I don't see any criminal liability. Here's why. Is because the ultimate actor who had the most contact, if not all contact, with Russian officials now post-election, this is while the transition was going on, was Mike Flynn. And he wasn't charged with any underlying crime of conspiracy. There is no such thing as collusion in federal law, so there would have to have been an act of conspiracy to violate statutes. Certainly Mike Flynn only pleaded to not telling the truth to the FBI. So if he is ultimately the one responsible for any kind of conspiracy, how can anybody else at the White House be tagged with that kind of behavior? Mike Flynn was the expert. He headed an intel agency. If he was even told to do something that he knew was wrong because of a political neophyte who's never served before, he should have been the one to stop it. He didn't. Thinking you're doing something wrong when it's not wrong is not right, but lying to the FBI is a crime.
You raised something interesting there. Also, President Trump's lawyer saying nothing about the guilty plea or the charge implicates anyone other than Mr. Flynn. For someone that is essentially now a confessed liar who is cooperating, I mean, what type of witness does that make?
Oh, certainly I think it implicates his credibility and it implicates how he could be trusted in moving forward. And I absolutely agree with my colleague. Perhaps it begins and ends with Flynn, but having confessed to lying to the FBI, which really was an unforced error, he simply didn't have to do that. It certainly changes the tenor of conversations moving forward.
So he lied specifically to FBI agents regarding conversations with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, regarding specifically U.S. sanctions against the Russian, also about votes regarding Israeli settlements. There's word that he may have spoken with Jared Kushner about that specifically. But during the transition, which would not be illegal. So lying about it would be, though, which is, of course, what Mr. Flynn is charged with. So why would you lie about just a non-crime, Brad?
Well, this is the political person's Achilles heel. It's never really the underlying crime and investigation that gets them in trouble. It's lying to the FBI or lying under oath to another official or during a trial. Why they do it, who knows? But if they had come clean, Flynn, with the FBI, there was certainly nothing wrong with what he did. And by the way, the Russians are very sophisticated. I bet you they even read our Constitution and understand that the president-elect has no power until noon on January 20th. And certainly they also know that Donald Trump, as a president-elect, has no influence over a lame duck president. So this is much to do about nothing. And certainly the Logan Act, which is something that people have been talking about, has never been prosecuted. And it's probably one of the worst statutes that were ever written in the 1700s.
And Michael, really the same kind of question. Of course, there was a lot of hype about Russian collusion at that time. It was really big in the news. There were a tremendous amount of reporting on it. But why lie about this, a non-crime?
Well, I again agree with my colleague on all points except the fact that the Logan Act need not be taken so seriously or pursued in this matter. And it goes to your question, which is they didn't have to do anything. All they had to do was wait until January 20th, and then you're not the president-elect. But I guess it speaks to the temperament and inexperience of the incoming administration that they simply couldn't help themselves. And once you do that and you realize you did something wrong, again, to my colleague's point, human nature perhaps, you compound it by lying. Why they did it? They didn't have to do any of this.
Now, there's a lot of talk about how this is essentially a soft charge, that Mr. Flynn could have been facing far greater charges, and that this could be a domino effect, that they have his cooperation, and this could lead to further arrests, further charges. And just knowing the circle that he traveled in prior to these charges, I mean, how concerned should people at the White House be, and anyone in the administration? Brad?
I don't think there's much concern because, to me, Michael Flynn is the biggest fish. He is the one who had all the contacts with the Russians and other governments in preparation for taking power. The fact that he may have been directed to do so, there is no crime in doing that. As a matter of fact, it's customary for President-elect staff, that's why it's called a transition, to reach out and establish relationships before you take office. So there was nothing to lie about. That's the problem here.
Michael, what do you think? Brad just said Flynn is the big fish. Do you think that's the case?
Oh, I think not. I think that there are people in the White House who are going to be very anxious for the next several days, if not weeks. And I think that within the president's inner circle, and I'm not saying this with any inside knowledge, it's just both as an attorney and as a political person, that they're trying to figure out who takes the fall and who is designated to be the end point in this conversation. But I don't think we're through with this analysis or investigation or conversation at all.
And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about where we stand. How close are we to the end of this investigation? The president lawyer has said that this clears the way for a prompt and reasonable conclusion. Do you think we're on the verge of wrapping things up as far as the Mueller investigation is concerned, Brad?
Yes, I do. I think the fact that a plea was taken by Flynn and it was only to one count of lying to the FBI, I think is a very positive sign to where this investigation is going. Certainly, if he was the star witness or other indictments were to follow in close order, they would have never put Flynn out there. We would have never heard about Flynn until others were indicted. That's my opinion.
Well, I would say, while I don't expect this is through, I really hope I hope it's done. I think whether you're on the left or the right, Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, everybody wants this over and to be past us so everybody can focus on governing.
Well, thank you very much. Both of you agree. We appreciate it. Thanks for both coming on. Brad Blakeman, Michael Toman, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Getting back to governing, imagine that. That would be a good thing. Another sexual harassment scandal, however, is rocking Congress. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi now calling for the resignation of Nevada Congressman Robert Kean after a former aide accused him of unwanted sexual advances. Meantime, Michigan Congressman John Conyers remains defiant and is refusing to step down amid multiple accusations of sexual harassment. Ellison Barber has more from Washington.
Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi called on Representative Ruben Kihuen to step down after a former staffer accused the Nevada Democrat of sexual harassment during his 2016 campaign. In a statement, Pelosi said, quote, "The young woman's documented account is convincing." The woman, only identified as Samantha, told BuzzFeed Kihuen repeatedly asked her for dates and sex, even though she repeatedly said no. Kihuen told BuzzFeed he is sorry for anything he did that, quote, made her feel uncomfortable. Kihuen is the most recent lawmaker accused of sexual harassment, but he is not the only one. According to a report in Politico, 84,000 taxpayer dollars were used to settle a 2014 sexual harassment claim against Texas Republican Representative Blake Farenthold. The money came from the Office of Compliance, which since 1997 has reportedly paid more than $17 million in settlements for various violations of employment rules, including sexual harassment. 3 former staffers accused longtime Congressman John Conyers of sexual harassment. Conyers denied the allegations but admitted to using $27,000 from his office's budget to settle a harassment claim made by a staffer, now identified as Marion Brown.
He pointed to areas of genital areas of his body and asked me to, touch it.
After that interview, Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi called on Conyers to resign. 5 women have accused Minnesota Senator Al Franken of groping them. A number of House Democrats have called on him to step down, but over in the Senate, top Democrats are saying just let the ethics investigation play out. In Washington, I'm Ellison Barber, Fox News.
Listen, thank you for that. A big day at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library as military leaders gather for the 5th Annual Reagan National Defense Forum. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster set to speak there shortly as we get new details on the latest North Korean missile launch. What we're learning about the weapon's trajectory.
Your wire.
Welcome back. We are awaiting remarks from National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who will be speaking to our very own Bret Baier at the Reagan National Defense Forum. Meanwhile, we're closely listening for any latest of the conversations on the rising threats from North Korea. Fox News learning now that the intercontinental ballistic missile launched by the rogue regime last week broke upon re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. This new test could potentially reach the U.S. mainland. But the warhead would be destroyed before hitting us. For more, let's bring in retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis. He's senior fellow and military expert at Defense Priorities. Sir, good of you to join us today, and thanks for weighing in on this all-important issue. You know, I keep hearing these comments about, well, it's going to break up on reentry, therefore it might not hit us. But the likelihood of it hitting us, just the mere chance of that, is enough to cause concern, right?
Yes, absolutely. You certainly can't bank on those things malfunctioning in the air. You have to assume that if they're fired, that there's ever a chance that it can have to hit the United States, which is one of the reasons why we, I think that the most important thing that we can do is to really reinforce deterrence to prevent them from ever launching one of those. And
I'm glad. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But I'm glad you talked about deterrence because you know there's a time for everything under the sun.
It could mean a nuclear weapon dropping on the United States, so we definitely don't want to get rid of diplomacy. But even during diplomacy, it's critically important that we communicate a very strong and powerful deterrent at all time. And you know, this conference going on in California with the Ronald Reagan, you know, his whole peace through strength. I mean, that's the way to go. But it's a peace and strength. So we want to use our strength to prevent them from using their weapons while pursuing any kind of chance at all we can have to prevent them from using any of these weapons so that no one has to die.
Okay, again, you raise a very good point. Peace through strength, which is, of course, what the former President Ronald Reagan had talked about, even going back to Teddy Roosevelt, carrying a big stick as well. But where's our big stick and our peace through strength when our military forces have been hurt so badly because of sequestration? We're talking about $100 billion in cuts, and that's affecting our training. We're having accidents. We're having to cannibalize parts to put on our current warplanes. The training is down. How do we maintain that strength in the face of what's happening?
And let me clearly say that while our level of training is not where we'd like it to be, our level of readiness can certainly be improved, but let there be no doubt in anybody's mind that our military is completely capable of handling anything that happens in North Korea. I assure you it is.
Well said. North Korea, but then we're on the front in Afghanistan, 16 years there. We have some beleaguered forces, but forces that are still ready. But let's get to the other point here. The U.S. intelligence community estimates that North Korea may have as many as 60 nuclear weapons. And now that they have proven they can launch missiles that might be capable of reaching the United States. There are also reports in North Korea they're developing weapons to destroy the U.S. power grid. North Korea's huge missile arsenal includes ICBMs, the solid fuel intermediate range missiles, and cruise missiles, and it's also developing submarine launch missiles. What do we have to do, again, to show that strength, to deter them, when we know that somewhere along the line someone is funneling money to North Korea to keep these things developed?
Well, we certainly do need to find, actively search on that and shut off any evidence or any access that we can to either technology or to money. But just consider also that during the entirety of the Cold War, when you had the murderous Mao Zedong of China and the even more murderous Joseph Stalin from the USSR. Both of those were crazy men, had nuclear weapons, and yet they were successfully deterred. So even though North Korea has these things, they can be deterred because they want these things for their regime's survival. They don't want to be committing suicide. They're not going to use these weapons because they know that we have 30, 40, 50 times as many weapons as they do, and we could annihilate them if even one is fired. And so we can use that to our advantage by keeping, that's why deterrence is such an important issue, that we can keep the keep them from using those weapons by promising that we'll destroy them if they do.
There's always the concern, however, that with all of the bluster and all of the threatening actions and provocative actions that North Korea is carrying out, there's always the concern of that one mistake, that one accident that could result in hurting our allies like Japan or some of our other allies like South Korea, or even hurting the United States. If that happens, then we have a problem on our hands that is tantamount to war.
Well, and that's why that's part of the nature of deterrence, is to make sure that they don't make any kind of calculation that would go against that, because they should know that if anything, even an accident happens, then we will respond. But I tell you this, we have to be critically aware of one fact. If they do have the ability to launch nuclear weapons, whether ICBM or intermediate range or anything else, and we actually try a military operation to take them out, but we don't succeed in them all, we could actually prompt them to fire that weapon.
Yeah, it could trigger it.
We just can't risk that.
So, Colonel, it's very delicate. So how do you deal with the funding sources or the funding streams that they're possibly receiving? And of course, some of the suspects would be China, the great suspicion lying there in the role that they might be providing funding for North Korea. But then there's also other countries like Russia, Iran, along with China. So how do we get those countries to get on board with all sincerity and all deliberate speed to put an end to the nuclear appetite that North Korea is displaying?
Well, I think it's important first to recognize that North Korea doesn't per se have a nuclear appetite. What they have is an appetite for self-preservation, and they perceive that the nuclear weapon is the only way that they can get it. China has been very out front on this. Actually, as recently as yesterday, in the Global Times, they said in response, to the last nuclear missile launch, that they are absolutely adamantly opposed to North Korea having the nuclear weapons, and they recognize and understand Washington's upset, but they said until we recognize that they have a self-preservation need, then it's going to be hard to come to any kind of an agreement.
I've got to interrupt you and keep it there. Certainly more conversation will be had on this all-important topic. But, Colonel, we thank you for joining us. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, he's a senior fellow for a Washington think tank, and we thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you very much.
All right.
President Trump's national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, is set to speak at any moment now there at the Reagan National Defense Forum in Simi Valley, California. We are looking there at the podium live now, awaiting his remarks. He, of course, the national security advisor to President Trump. He has a long history of serving in the military and the Army, and actually remains on active duty now. We see there at the podium right at this moment now, John Heybusch. He is the director there out at the Presidential Library, the busiest presidential library across the nation, set in a beautiful location there, as I mentioned, in Simi Valley, California. He'll be introducing H.R. McMaster, and then following the remarks from Mr. McMaster, we'll also be hearing from our own anchor, Bret Baier, of course the host of Special Report, in a long and engaging discussion that he'll be having with with H.R. McMaster following the remarks. Following those remarks, we're expected that conversation will last about 20 minutes and could be very far-ranging. This is a forum that draws people together from across the defense industry, members of our lawmakers, as well as our national leaders. Our Pentagon correspondent Jennifer Grishman has been talking about some of the issues there on the ground as she reports there live throughout the course of this gathering. Some of the issues they'll be discussing: military readiness, regarding how ready we are to respond to threats. Of course, North Korea at the top of mind, the recent missile tests there, and what that could mean for our nation.
You know, one of the biggest problems that we've been facing, as we were discussing with Lieutenant Colonel Davis just moments ago, and we also heard it in one of the reports from Jennifer Griffin as she was reporting, talking to the Air Force Secretary, there is concern about sequestration, which was 5 years ago, $100 billion. That has definitely, in so many terms, taken a lot of strength away from our training, away from our equipment. And so all of that has to be looked at. And obviously when you have a forum like this and you're talking about our national defense, it's very important to talk about how do we get that budget back in line so that we're taking care of all the training needs we have. And again, as Lieutenant Colonel Davis talked about, as well as the Air Force Secretary to Jennifer Griffin, we do have a sense of readiness. We're prepared for any battle, but keep in mind how beleaguered our forces are in terms of 16 years at war with Afghanistan and other threats throughout the world. There's Africa, there's the threat from terrorism, ISIS. We've been putting them on the run, but we still have to be ready. The President of the United States saying if North Korea should conduct something untoward, our allies as well as our own domestic homeland, that we will move in. Nikki Haley, the ambassador to the UN, going on to say that we will utterly destroy North Korea. But again, keep in mind that when talk like that rises, you want to be sure that we're not only ready but we're also well trained.
Questions about if we're on the verge of yet another Cold War rising. And throughout the reporting recently at Fox News, journalists have been talking about military readiness, jets that aren't ready to fly, bombers that aren't ready to fly, going in and harvesting what famously is called the boneyard for parts to be ready, a shortage of fighter pilots. Let's go ahead and take a listen now to what John Heybush is saying, and as we await H.R. McMaster and his speech.
Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the Reagan Defense Forum for bringing together such a talented and dedicated group of people for these discussions. It is such a privilege to be among so many old friends and teachers and mentors and colleagues, fellow officers. Today, what I would like to talk with you about is about reclaiming America's strategic confidence. It is hard to imagine a more appropriate place to hold this discussion than this hall, a place that honors a leader who secured our nation, who helped bring down the Berlin Wall, and who ensured that freedom and liberty triumphed over communist totalitarianism. For those of us old enough, and it looks like most of us are old enough, this majestic building and its beautiful vistas evoke memories of when we learned the heartbreaking news of President Ronald Reagan's death. At the time, the news media, which was not always friendly to the president, struggled to handle that monumental event in American history. The American people showed us the way. More than 100,000 people came here to this library to pay their respects. It was reported that traffic was so congested approaching the library that mourners, anticipating an hour-and-a-half drive, remained in their cars for 6 hours, a long time even for people routinely subjected to Los Angeles traffic. A young man, Reagan Wilson, named for the president, told the New York Times that he had been very emotional in the wake of the president's death. The story of Reagan, he said, is the story of America, one of manifest destiny. Our founders believed that the greatest wisdom of our nation rests in the hearts and in the minds of the American people. President Reagan shared this belief, and we saw its undeniable truth in the days that followed his passing. When President Reagan took office in 1981, many believed that Washington was not serving the American people well. Our confidence at home and our influence abroad had waned significantly over the past decade. The Soviet Union appeared to be on the rise, and America, it seemed, was in decline. President Reagan ushered in a dramatic rethinking of America's role in the world and a dramatic renewal of American confidence. America would not only triumph in the Cold War and beyond, but reach a new height of influence and prosperity. He described, quote, a future of growth, opportunity, and security, anchored by the values of a people who are confident, compassionate, and whose heart is good. Reagan assertively declared that it was communism that would lie on the ash heap of history, not democracy, and not the United States of America. This unshakable confidence in our principles and in our vision for the world made us stronger and made us more secure. In 1987, armed with this confidence, President Reagan signed the first ever national security strategy. Today, as we approach the unveiling of the Trump administration's national security strategy, we are at a similar crossroads. Revisionist powers, Russia and China, are subverting the post-World War II political, economic, and security orders to advance their own interests at our expense and at the expense of our allies. The rogue regimes of Iran and North Korea are violating the sovereignty of their neighbors, pursuing weapons of mass destruction, and exporting terror to other nations. Jihadist terrorist organizations such as ISIS threaten all civilized people in every corner of the world. These national security challenges also require a dramatic rethinking of American foreign policy from previous decades. President Trump will soon unveil the details of his new strategy, but I can tell you now that it will focus on protecting our homeland, advancing American prosperity, preserving peace through strength, a phrase the origins of which will not be lost on this audience, and finally, enhancing American influence. Today, I would like to tell you how we are reclaiming the strategic confidence necessary for implementing this strategy through understanding in 4 areas. First, the values that define our nation. Second, the full instruments of our power. Third, the threats facing our nation. And fourth, the dynamic and competitive nature of our security environment. First, understanding the values that define our nation and who we are. President Reagan described America as a shining city upon a hill and boldly spoke truth about the sufferings of people living under fear and oppression. Today, we are reclaiming this confidence in American values. In Warsaw, the President proudly proclaimed, "We value the dignity of every human life, protect the rights of every person, and share the hope of every soul to live in freedom." In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the President noted that those who do not confront Islamist terrorism would be judged both by history and by God. Most recently in South Korea, the President spoke truth about the human rights violations of the North Korean regime, which he noted imprisons its people under the banner of tyranny, fascism, and oppression. He has matched this clear commitment to American values and principles with action in responding to Assad's use of the most heinous weapons on earth to commit mass murder of innocent civilians, including children. The President further demonstrated his commitment to American values with changes in our policies toward Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela. Second, understanding the full instruments of our power. President Reagan understood that diplomacy and military force were both important and equally vital tools for national power. President Trump is focused on aligning our diplomatic, economic, military, informational, intelligence, and law enforcement efforts since the first days of his administration. A great example of this has been the President's new strategy in South Asia, which he outlined for the American people in an address on August 21st of this year. After a comprehensive review of our strategic options in the region, the President decided on a new strategy grounded in the integration of all instruments of national power. We would no longer confuse activity with progress. Our military efforts and operations in the region, combined with the efforts of our partners, would focus on what brought us to Afghanistan in 2001, to deny terrorists safe havens that they can use to threaten America and threaten our allies. Third, understanding the threats and security challenges we face. President Reagan had a clear-eyed view of the national security threats facing America during his tenure. President Trump and his national security team have also clearly described the threats that emanate from revisionist powers, rogue regimes, and jihadist terrorist organizations. I'd like to acknowledge the great work of our intelligence professionals under Director Coates, Director Mike Pompeo, with Mike Pompeo here with us today. The administration's approach of principled realism also adapts a realistic view of our security environment. For this reason, we do not base national security decisions on rigid ideology, but instead on our core national interests and clearly defined objectives derived from those interests. Some threats are more obvious than others. On the recent Asia trip, the President spoke out forcefully against unfair trade and economic policies, which have disadvantaged American workers and companies. For too long, Washington turned a blind eye to cheating and exploitive practices abroad. We, in large measure, vacated the competitive economic space, and the American people paid the price. We've also been clear-eyed about the more obvious threat from North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile development. The President is committed to the total denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. He has no delusions about the North Korean dictator's intentions and recognizes the danger we all face. The era of strategic patience is over, and we will not repeat failed efforts of the past. Fourth, understanding the dynamic and competitive nature of our security environment. We must acknowledge that the international system is, above all, characterized by competition, interaction, and change. President Reagan fully understood this reality. In 1983, he signed National Security Decision Directive 75, which argued that containing and reversing Soviet influence required competing effectively on a sustained basis in all international arenas. The United States wants all nations to be strong, proud, and independent, and we want all people to have the opportunity to rise. We will compete, but competition must be fair. Our economic relationships will respect our partners' sovereignty over their economic destinies, while ensuring that American workers and American companies are not unfairly disadvantaged. With competition comes change. As his presidency neared its conclusion, President Reagan was asked about his use of the term evil empire to describe the Soviet Union. He responded, they had been talking about another time, another era. We must be willing to adjust strategy to changes in the security environment while remaining focused on our core national security interests. For example, the President's new vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific imagines a community of nations that are strong, independent, and thriving, and a future of many dreams for the people of the region. So to summarize, confronting the security challenges of today will require us to reclaim our strategic confidence. I would be grateful for your ideas on how we might better understand and apply all of our instruments of national power, understand the threats and opportunities we face, and understand and adapt to the dynamic and competitive nature of today's security environment. It is a true honor to be here with you at the Reagan Library, a living testament to the legacy of a president whose national security strategy helped make the world a safer and more humane place. As a historian, I know the stacks within these walls are full of numerous documents that record President Reagan's record and President Reagan and his team's remarkable achievements in defense and security. Our national security team recognizes that today's problems are not wholly unprecedented. We are committed to learning from the past to acquire the deep understanding essential to protect the homeland, advance American prosperity, preserve peace through strength, and enhance American influence. Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with Brett. Thank you.
As the General said, we'd like to invite Fox News Chief Political Anchor Brett Baier to the stage to interview the General. Brett.
Thanks, John. General.
Great to see you.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. After that introduction and laying out the principles of this strategy that you say the President's going to unveil, let's start broadly. In your mind, what is the greatest threat to national security?
Well, I would say that as we look at the time horizon associated with threats, the greatest immediate threat to the United States and to the world is the threat posed by the rogue regime in North Korea and his continued efforts to develop a long-range nuclear capability. And so it's immensely important that we work together with all of our allies, partners, everyone internationally to convince Kim Jong-un that the continued pursuit of these capabilities is a dead end for him and his regime.
So let me get a little specific on North Korea. We're being told that the ICBM, the most recent launch, broke up on re-entry. Is North Korea having trouble on that re-entry step, and thereby right now the U.S. overall is not at threat from their ballistic missiles?
Well, it'll take some time to assess each of these missile launches, but what is clear is that every time he conducts a missile launch and nuclear test, he gets better. And whether it's a success or failure isn't as important as understanding that over the years, he's been learning from failures, improving, and thereby increasing his threat to all of us.
So has the potential of war with North Korea increased since this latest launch?
I think it's increasing every day, which means that we're in a race, really. We're in a race to be able to solve this problem, not just us, right, but the United States, all of our allies and partners. As we know, China has tremendous coercive economic power over North Korea. I mean, you can't shoot a missile without fuel, right? And so there are ways to address this problem short of armed conflict, but it is a race because he's getting closer and closer, and there's not much time left.
So is China serious about averting this conflict? I mean, are they slow walking this?
Well, you know, the initial indications were very positive. The president, as you know, very early in his presidency, met with President Xi in Mar-a-Lago. And there were some very significant results from that initial discussion
about North Korea. That, I think, represented dramatic changes potentially in China's not only their attitude toward the problem, but also the actions that they could take. The first of these is that China agreed that this is a threat to everyone. This is a global threat. This is a threat to China. Remember, in the past, the old language would be, well, this is really a problem between the United States and North Korea. The second big change is that China was wholly committed, and President Xi affirmed this again during President Trump's recent visit to Beijing, is that China is committed to the complete denuclearization of North Korea. And remember, in the past, and still sometimes even today, you see a lapse back into the language of freeze for freeze or suspension for suspension. That's not the objective. Negotiations for negotiation's sake, not the objective. The objective is denuclearization. And that's a big shift as well. And the third big shift is China recognizes that it does have tremendous coercive economic power over North Korea. So we're asking China not to do us or anybody a favor. We're asking China to act in China's interest, as they should. And we believe increasingly that it's in China's urgent interests to do more beyond UN Security Council resolutions. As we know, we cannot rely on an international body because there are those within that body who obstruct that important work. For example, Russia just vetoed the joint investigative mechanism for the use of chemical weapons in Syria to provide more cover for the Assad regime to potentially commit further mass murder. We know that getting the sanctions that we need 100% cut off, I think, would be appropriate at this point. The President believes that. Of oil and fuel to North Korea may be impossible from a UN Security Council resolution, but that doesn't constrain China or any other nation from taking the bilateral actions that they can take above and beyond that.
Well, China just sent an envoy to North Korea. Does that mean that that envoy failed, that they had this launch?
Well, as you know, Kim Jong-un isn't particularly cordial to anyone, right? And even his own people. And so I don't think it came as a surprise to Chinese leadership that this envoy was rejected and was not didn't even have a meeting with Kim Jong-un. And so the prospects now for any dramatic change in his behavior without some significant new actions in the form of much more severe sanctions, complete enforcement of the sanctions that are in place now, I think it's extremely unlikely for us to. He's not going to have a Grinch moment, I don't think, with his heart grows 2 sizes larger, and we see him change his behavior.
I didn't think we were going to get a Grinch reference. That's pretty good. This close to Christmas. A couple more things about North Korea, and we'll move around the world, if you would. Understanding that diplomacy is the preference here, obviously. Understanding that there are many military plans and options, there always are, for North Korea. Is there any military option that does not include the death of tens of thousands of South Koreans?
Well, we know for sure that this is what Kim Jong-un has done, right? Since 1950, right? Is held the population of South Korea hostage, right? Every provocation, every hostile act has originated from the north. He has in the past been able to do that, obviously with large conventional capability, all these artillery pieces and rockets and so forth that exist not too far north of Seoul.
Hundreds of them.
So, right, thousands of munitions and so forth. And so there's no military course of action that comes without risk. And that's why our alliance with South Korea, with Japan, those alliances are stronger than ever. What Kim Jong-un is doing is driving us closer and closer together and coalescing the international community against Kim Jong-un. If you think about what's happened just in recent months, and I think this ought to be something maybe we ought to provide a roll-up of, but countries across the globe have taken action beyond UN Security Council resolutions. First of all, South Korea and Japan are improving their defense capabilities at breakneck speed, and they're doing that in cooperation with us. We're doing that through joint bilateral exercises and multilateral exercises in Korea and elsewhere. but also we're doing it with improved defense capabilities. But what's been striking, I think, is how many nations have expelled North Korean diplomats who have ceased all economic relations with North Korea. This is from the Philippines to Thailand to Vietnam to Sudan to Brazil to Mexico. I mean, so many examples of countries who are acting beyond the UN Security Council resolutions and supporting all of our efforts to convince Kim Jong-un that this is a dead end, diplomatically and economically.
So should Americans feel safe about going to the Winter Olympics in Seoul in February?
Yes, Americans should feel safe because we have an extraordinarily ready and capable military. And that military is getting stronger every day based on the President's priority to address what had been this big bow wave, really, of deferred military modernization. He's strengthening all of our services and their capabilities, and I think that's pretty apparent.
Sure, but did you sign off on the U.S. team being a part of that Olympics, the White House or the NSC?
I don't even know if there's a process for doing that, but I'm certain that we would. And
I guess the question is,
the President assured President Moon just last week that there'll be a strong presidential delegation. You know, I'll tell you one of the great things about going to South Korea is what you get to see is the stark contrast between two systems. Right? You see, you know, look at South Korea in 1953, a country ravaged by decades of war, no natural resources, a population that undereducated, largely illiterate because of the war that they had been under. You had, frankly, a corrupt government, and a hostile neighbor. It looked pretty bleak. Look at South Korea now. What a thriving country, 5th largest economy in Asia. Then just go a few miles north across the 38th parallel and look at the hell that is North Korea. And you see today a dramatic contrast, even probably more dramatic than that which existed, you know, across the walls and fences that divided Eastern and Western Europe during the Cold War.
It's a dangerous time. We'll bounce around. Has cooperating, you mentioned Syria, has cooperating with Russia in Syria cemented Bashar al-Assad in power?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that de facto, Bashar al-Assad, to the great disappointment of us and the Syrian people, you know, is in power. And so what's needed is a political transition that allows all Syrians to have a say in the future nature of that government so they can get out of this horrible humanitarian crisis. How can Assad be part of that? It's really hard to imagine, right? Somebody who has committed mass murder of his own people, how does that work? We're going to ask the Syrian population to accept him? You know, millions of refugees and displaced people, murdered people, imprisoned and tortured people, families all of whom almost every family's lost someone based on the brutality of this regime and its interaction with the other brutal enemies that we're fighting on that territory, ISIS and al-Nusra and other groups. So what's needed in Syria is a consolidation of gains over ISIS and a consolidation in such a way that it can bridge into a political process that can deliver enduring security. What Syria has become is a destructive cycle of sectarian violence. That who takes advantage of that? These Islamist terrorist organizations like Daesh or ISIS and Al-Qaeda related groups like Nusra, and the Iranians. And what the Iranians have done across the greater Middle East is fuel and accelerate these cycles of violence so that they can take advantage of these chaotic environments, take advantage of weak states to make them dependent on them for support.
So how can the U.S. roll back Iran's gains in the Middle East then?
Well, by a comprehensive strategy. And I think it's fair to say that in recent years, in maybe what we can say, certainly in retrospect, was an unrealistically hopeful strategy that, given a nuclear deal, what the President has called the worst deal ever, that deal would result in an Iran that would integrate more effectively in the region, that would change its behavior. But you know what's happened? The exact opposite has happened. And I think the focus on trying to accommodate Iran has empowered Iran across the whole region. And so when the president says he's inherited a mess, that mess, I think, is in North Korea, but it's also in the greater Middle East, where we have to address what is a growing Iranian capability and an ability to use proxies, militias, terrorist organizations to advance their aim, their hegemonic aims in the region. And what they're in the middle of doing now is using a sophisticated campaign of subversion in Iraq and a continued support for Assad. About 80% of Assad's fighters are Iranian proxies in Syria, to establish this kind of land bridge over into the Mediterranean. And so what we face is the prospect of Iran having a proxy army on the borders of Israel. What we see is the weaponization of Iran's network in Yemen, in southern Lebanon. They're trying to do it in Syria with these long-range missiles, and they're increasing the threat that Iran poses to the whole region through this Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and their proxies. So what we have in place now is a comprehensive strategy for Iran, and denying Iran all paths to a nuclear weapon is one part of that strategy. Countering Iran's destabilizing behavior is another critical part of that strategy. And so I think you've seen some significant changes in how we're working with allies and partners in the region to affect that.
Given the threats, especially from North Korea and Iran that we just talked about, why do you think there is no bipartisan urgency to significantly increase defense spending?
Yeah, well, I think there should be. The president thinks that there should be, and it's something the president is working on urgently now. So there are some dramatic examples of why we need an end to the defense sequester, why we need a higher degree of predictability in the defense budget. As I mentioned, there's a huge bow wave of deferred modernization, but also each of our services aren't big enough. I mean, look at what the president said during the campaign. He was very clear on what we had to do in the area of modernization and what we had to do to make sure that our armed forces had the depth, those capabilities, and sufficient scale, right, to deal with these crises, to protect our security and our interests.
But General, you know, the criticism up on Capitol Hill is that the hawks were a little bit disappointed with the number that they got from the president and you all from the budget.
Yeah. Well, what the president has done is dramatically increased defense spending to address the most egregious gaps. And this is the beginning. This is the beginning of a recovery in military capabilities and in military capacity, depth in those forces. Now, what Secretary Mattis has prioritized initially is the first thing you've got to do is make sure the forces you have are ready. And so a lot of resources have gone into that now, but what's really needed is our new capabilities to deal with our adversaries who've watched us closely. And while we cut back on modernization, they developed kind of a narrow range of capabilities, but capabilities that threaten what used to be our ability to overmatch our enemies. Now, we are still extraordinarily capable. If we go to a fight, it's not going to be a fair fight for any enemy who takes us on. But we have to invest now to ensure we maintain that overmatch.
Congress overwhelmingly approved sanctions against Russia in July. It's been a slow process to see those implemented. Why?
Well, you know, I always think that you can get the instant sanction. You know, you just go to the Treasury and say sanction, and it happens. But I've learned the process now. It takes some time to make sure we do it right, to make sure we sanction the right entities. So the State Department has released its guidance. Treasury, some of the most overworked people in our government are in our awesome Treasury Department, who do the hard analytical work, who ensure that we can meet the threshold for in placing these sanctions. But I'll tell you, there's no holding back on it. But if you think about it, sanctions are relevant to countering Russia's destabilizing behavior, and we're moving out on that as fast as we can. But it's also to increase the economic isolation and pressure on the North Korean regime. It's also to sanction Iran's behavior associated with their missile development in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and to sanction their behavior based on their support for terrorist organizations and their proxies. If you look at Venezuela, right, and the victimization of the the Venezuelan people and doing everything we can in support with our allies and partners to communicate to Maduro that he has to restore his citizens' constitutional rights. That has a lot to do with sanctions. So there's nobody taking any days off these days in the Treasury Department.
In the campaign, arming Ukrainians was part of the pitch. Is that still the policy of the administration?
Yes, and what we're continuing to do is strengthen Ukrainian defensive capabilities. And as everybody knows, that's been based on non-lethal assistance. But the Ukrainians are very capable. And I saw General John Abizaid here, who's had a big role in this. The Ukrainians are embarked on a significant governmental reform effort, but also a military reform effort. And I think it would be extremely difficult for Russian proxies, Russia, to be able to make significant gains if they were to extend the territory that they're controlling after their invasion of Ukraine.
It's a dangerous world, and you look around the world and there are a ton of hot spots. This next question is politically sensitive, but you said everything was open when we started this thing. Does an event like the indictment of your predecessor carry some kind of foreign policy or national security impact? In other words, do foreign allies get rattled by it? Do adversaries get emboldened by it? Does it somehow constrain the Trump administration foreign policy?
No, I've seen no evidence of the investigation in any way impeding the important work that we're doing. So what we're endeavoring to do is to regain our strategic focus. And so what the President asked us to do in the National Security Council is devolve responsibilities and authorities and decision-making back to the departments and agencies who have to execute those policies, and we've done that. And with all that time that we've saved, mulling about tactical details, we've established a very strong foundation of strategy, clearly articulated objectives for the main national security challenges we're facing. Now, one of those challenges is Russia, and what we're endeavoring to do with Russia is three things. We need to counter Russia's destabilizing behavior that we saw really grow significantly in the last several years, right? You can go back to the denial of service attacks in Estonia in 2007, invasion of Georgia 2008, invasion of Ukraine, the intervention on the side of the Assad regime in Syria. You could just go on and on. There's a disturbing pattern. And then, of course, you have the subversion of democracies broadly in the West. Europe has suffered in particular from this. You saw Russian hands in the Catalonia independence referendum. You're starting to see Russia active in Mexico, and well in advance of the Mexican election. So what we've been focused on is the three things we have to do with Russia: counter their destabilizing behavior, including the so-called hybrid warfare or new generation warfare, where they attempt to use a sophisticated strategy of subversion, but really disinformation and propaganda to polarize communities and affect our confidence. I gave this talk about strategic confidence. It's really an element of that. Part of reclaiming our strategic confidence is having confidence in what unifies us as Americans. And so it would be great if every time we talk about what divides us, we also at least give equal time to what unites us as Americans. So we want to confront Russia's destabilizing behavior. We want to deter conflict with Russia, right? It wouldn't be in anybody's interest to have a large-scale conflict with Russia. And the third thing, though, we need to do is try to find areas of cooperation with Russia. So our Russia policy is very practically focused now and forward-looking to do those three things.
So you don't think your counterparts around the world were rattled by yesterday?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we're in very close contact. There's sort of a national security advisors support group, that we have. We get together periodically at conferences, and we're always on the phone with each other. And there's tremendous confidence. I think there's more confidence in the United States, frankly. I think there's a sense that we are re-engaging in areas where we had largely disengaged. I mean, you might remember a Foreign Affairs article maybe 3 years ago or so. It sort of celebrated the post-American Middle East as if this was a triumph. Well, how's that working out, right? What we've endeavored to do is to engage in a meaningful way with allies and partners to break this horrible cycle of sectarian violence, to have the enduring defeat of of ISIS. We have now, with our allies and partners, defeated ISIS in 95% of the so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq. There's a lot to celebrate in what's going on. I mean, the situation is in the Middle East right now. It's very tenuous. Yemen, horrible humanitarian crisis there. We're working very hard to address that, to convince others that they have to address that as a matter of urgency. But in general, U.S. re-engagement in that region and in other areas has been welcomed and I think has been encouraging.
General McMaster, thank you for your candid remarks. Thank you for your service to the country, sir.
Thank you, Brett. What a privilege to be with you and everyone. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thanks a lot. And we have enjoyed our own Brett Baer, who is our chief political anchor and correspondent, of course, and the anchor of Special Report. And he was just having a very candid conversation about our defense posture and our way moving forward there with National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. One of the key things that Brett brought out is that this is a very dangerous world in which we live. And he went to the core that many people would probably want to know, and that is, did the legal troubles of former NSA advisor, which would be Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, did his guilty plea have any bearing on our allies? To which Mr. McMaster wanted to say, absolutely not. We're having more strength. But he talked about a range of topics from Korea to the Middle East to the situation in Syria, Yemen, and even Ukraine, and Venezuela and Mexico. And for more on this, we'll go now to Molly.
And when you hear a list like that, you know how great the challenges are that we face here in America, particularly when it comes to the military readiness, and also diplomatic pressures all around the world. Joining me now to address all of these questions and topics, John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a Fox News contributor. Thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
Now, we've been keeping an eye on the forum there in Simi Valley that brings together defense contractors, members of the administration to talk about military readiness. And we had the opportunity to listen to the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, speak, as well as the interview with our own anchor, Brett Baer, the follow-up. He asked McMaster what the greatest threat facing America was. Not particularly shocking answer. He said North Korea. I'd also like to get your assessment on that.
Well, I think North Korea is part of it, but I think the threat as a whole, the strategic threat, is the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction more broadly, including chemical and biological weapons. That's why I think President Trump's strike against the Assad regime in Syria for the use of chemical weapons was a very, very important aspect of this. And I frankly don't think you can divorce North Korea from Iran. I think cooperation between Iran and North Korea, historically on ballistic missiles and almost certainly on the nuclear side, puts them together. And it's part of a bigger strategic picture, and that is, if North Korea or Iran or both get a deliverable nuclear weapons capability, I'm afraid that decades of counterproliferation efforts led by the United States will have failed. And I think this will be a massive failure of American national security policy and presage proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to countless other countries. So this is not a one-off with North Korea. This is determining whether the 21st century, I think, will be a world where many, many more countries, dozens more countries, get nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, or whether we can draw the line here.
You know, as you're bringing that up, we just have some very recent reporting from our own national security correspondent, Jennifer Griffin, who also happens to be on the ground out there in California, speaking about this latest ballistic missile launch on the part of North Korea, and that it broke up on reentry. It's a hurdle they haven't been able to get past, one that apparently protects us, at least for now, from a warhead actually striking the continental United States. I mean, is there any relief in that, or do you think North Korea is actually getting very, very close, as we've seen them advance so rapidly recently?
No, I think General McMaster made the correct point that every launch brings them closer to the objective, whether every aspect of it succeeds or not. In the 1950s, when Vanguard and Jupiter C missiles were blowing up on launch pads in the United States, our rocket scientists, and they were rocket scientists, would describe these catastrophes as 90% successes. And the reason was that they had to know where the weak spots were in their science and their engineering. You know, it's not at all clear what was under the nose cone of the rocket on this most recent launch, and therefore we can't really tell what that implies once they put a thermonuclear warhead under it. So I think we've still got some time. I don't think that, for example, if we launched a preemptive strike against North Korea's nuclear program, that they could retaliate by hitting the United States with nuclear weapons. But our intelligence is imperfect. And that's why there is precious little time to make a decision whether there's any prospect of North Korea denuclearizing on its own or under Chinese pressure, or whether we're going to have to use military force. We can't blink at this any longer. That's the choice we're coming up to very, very rapidly.
Ambassador, something you just touched on briefly a moment ago when you talked about the proliferation of weapons around the world. McMaster talked about how all of these challenges have essentially brought our allies together, that now we're working to a greater degree with South Korea, with Japan. Is that something we're seeing on fronts all around the globe with rogue regimes, not just North Korea, but as you mentioned, Iran?
Well, I think the record here is divided. I mean, I think South Korea, for example, is very split internally on how to handle the North Korean threat. But let's not forget, just a few days before President Trump's recent Asia trip, Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, agreed with China on no further deployments of the THAAD air defense system, no trilateral cooperation with the U.S. and Japan on missile defense, and no trilateral defense alliance with Japan and the United States. Now, that's been his position for a long time. That's very dangerous.
All right, Ambassador, I hate to cut you off, but I'm getting a wrap here. Thank you so much for your insights.
Glad to be with you.
Fox News Alert, we're looking at the president. That's Air Force One landing at Joint Base Andrews. And, of course, the president is returning from New York City after a series of fundraisers that he conducted here today. But he took the time today to weigh in on the guilty plea entered by his former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, tweeting this: "I had to fire General Flynn because he lied to the Vice President and the FBI. He has pled guilty to those lies. It is a shame because his actions during the transition were lawful. There was nothing to hide." Garrett Tenney has been following the details of all of this. He joins us live now at the White House as the president is landing across town over there at Joint Base Andrews. Garrett, what can you tell us?
Well, Kelly, that tweet from the president is really in line with what we've been hearing from the White House over the past 24 hours, which is that Michael Flynn cooperating with Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team is really no big deal, and that there is no reason for the administration to be concerned. And this morning, as the president was leaving the White House, he said as much to reporters before taking off on Marine One.
No, I'm not. And what has been shown is no collusion. No collusion. There's been absolutely no collusion, so we're very happy. We'll see what happens. Thank you all very much.
So while the White House says it is still confident investigators will find no wrongdoing related to collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, there are concerns that Flynn's cooperation could cause Special Counsel Robert Mueller to expand his investigation and potentially create other issues for the administration. And that's why the White House is also now trying to distance itself a bit from Flynn and really diminish his role in the campaign, the transition, as well as the early days of the administration. And the president's attorney, Ty Cobb, even went as far to label Flynn as a former Obama administration official and made it a point to note in a statement that Flynn was only National Security Advisor for 25 days before he was fired. Now, most legal experts believe that considering the deal that Flynn was given, Special Counsel Robert Mueller likely believes Flynn does have information that will be helpful for his investigation. As for what that information might be, we don't know what we don't know. And that is why the White House is anxious in the days ahead. Kelly?
Well, you say anxious, but we also saw that the current National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, General H.R. McMaster, was talking to our own Brett Baer just moments ago in Simi Valley at the Reagan Presidential Library. And Brett had asked him, it's a dangerous world out there. Do foreign allies get rattled by this news about General Flynn? And do our adversaries get more emboldened? And General McMaster said, no, they are moving forward. But let's shift to the other topic at hand. The president is also talking about tax reform today. Garrett, what is he saying?
Well, Kelly, you mentioned tax reform and a lot of the president's agenda. The concern here is that all this is going to get lost in the investigation and that the administration can't really push those issues forward. So the president today, he was able to talk about tax reform at a number of fundraisers in New York City this morning. And the Senate passing its tax reform bill last night really was a big win for President to be able to go and give that deliverable to his fundraiser attendees there at that event. And he's really touting that success, and this morning he described it as fantastic, and he said that he believes he'll have a final version on his bill by Christmas. Kelly?
Yeah, a lot of members of the Republican Guard say that is definitely going to happen. The Republicans are very jubilant along with the president. We will continue to follow the developments, and again, we're looking at Air Force One, not far from Garrett-Tenney, across the water there, across the Potomac River, right there in Maryland at Joint Base Andrews, and we'll continue to follow the developments. The president landing safely back in D.C.
And President Trump is slamming Senate Democrats after all 48 of them vote against the Republican tax bill. So what happens next? We'll discuss that coming up.